The skies over Europe are the color of gunmetal, cold, silent, and expectant. Through that thin gray air, German radar operators begin to see unfamiliar shapes, long wings, twin engines, and a split tail that glints like a blade. Pilots scramble to intercept, peering upward toward a machine that looks more like a mistake than a threat. Ein amerikanischer Irrtum, one pilot jokes over the radio, an American mistake. When they finally see it, two booms, two propellers spinning in opposite directions, the laughter follows. The Luftwaffe calls it der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, half mockery, half disbelief. To them, it is ungainly, overbuilt, absurd. No fighter so large could possibly maneuver with grace. From their cockpits, the German pilots circle the new intruder and sneer. It seems a contradiction of design, a bomber trying to be a fighter, an engineer's fantasy misplaced in a war that rewards simplicity. They're sending furniture, not fighters, one laughs, as the strange machine banks away into cloud. Even American officers on the ground share quiet doubts. Two engines mean twice the weight, twice the cost, twice the failure. Why build one when you could build two of something simpler? But in the hangars of England, mechanics already whisper another story. Beneath its skin, the aircraft hides an intelligence no one yet understands. Turbo superchargers that breathe life into thin air, counter-rotating propellers that cancel torque, and firepower concentrated in a single steady stream. To the untrained eye, it is ungainly. To the mind that conceived it, it is evolution. The P-38 Lightning is unlike anything in the sky because it was never meant to resemble the past. It was built not for the dogfight, but for the horizon, to strike faster, higher, and farther than any pilot had imagined possible. For now, it moves unseen, a shadow between clouds and ridicule. The Luftwaffe still laughs, and intelligence briefings dismiss it as a curiosity, a reconnaissance platform, a footnote. But the war is young, and so is the machine. What they cannot yet know is that this strange twin-headed creature will soon descend from those same clouds, and when it does, the laughter will stop. Before the P-38 Lightning ruled the skies, it existed only as an idea, a bold entry in a 1937 design contest issued by the United States Army Air Corps. The brief was as audacious as it was simple. Build an interceptor capable of flying higher, faster, and farther than anything on Earth. For most manufacturers, the request bordered on fantasy. But at Lockheed's Burbank headquarters, a 27-year-old engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson read the proposal and smiled. To him, it was not a challenge. It was a dare. Johnson gathered a small team in a cramped hangar they called Skunk Works, before the name meant anything to history. Around drafting tables and cigarette smoke, they began to imagine a machine that defied convention. Where others drew single engines, Johnson drew two. Where others placed the cockpit in a sleek fuselage, he suspended it between twin booms, a bridge between engines that would turn air into power. The design seemed symmetrical, almost alien, not an aircraft, but an equation in motion. It was a risk few companies would have taken. Twin engines meant double the complexity, double the maintenance, and, in theory, double the failure. But Johnson understood something others did not. Redundancy was survival. Two engines meant endurance. Two engines meant trust. And in an era when pilots routinely died from mechanical failure, trust was worth any cost. By 1938, the prototype had a name, the XP-38. Sleek, silver, and sharp-edged, it looked like the future given form. Test flights at March Field astonished observers. The twin Allison engines, each fitted with turbo superchargers, hurled the craft past 400 miles per hour, faster than any fighter ever built. Reporters called it the Lightning. Johnson simply called it Proof. Then, on February 11th, 1939, tragedy met triumph. During a cross-country demonstration flight, the XP-38 tore through the skies in record time, reaching speeds no American aircraft had ever achieved. But as it approached Mitchell Field in New York, frost formed in its carburetors. The engines lost power. The sleek silver shape, symbol of hope and genius, fell short of the runway by a few hundred yards and shattered across the ground. The newspapers mourned what they saw as the death of an experiment. Lockheed's competitors quietly nodded. Another dream, undone by its own ambition. But inside the company, no one spoke of failure. Kelly Johnson's engineers swept the debris into boxes, studying every twisted spar and fractured rivet. To them, the wreck was not an ending, but a blueprint written in reverse. The prototype had proven its concept. The next version would perfect it. By summer, the redesign began. Cooling systems were rerouted, controls refined, frames reinforced. Johnson's credo guided them. Be fast, be firm, be fearless. Every adjustment was a lesson, every mistake a step toward mastery. Out of the wreckage rose a new generation of Lightnings, stronger, sharper, and more precise. The result was unlike anything in the sky. With its turbo-supercharged engines, the P-38 could climb higher than any other Allied fighter. Its counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque, allowing unmatched stability. Its sleek, twin-boom design cut through air with mathematical precision. It was not simply a machine, it was a declaration that engineering, not intuition, would define the next war. Military officials still hesitated. The P-38 was expensive, complex, and ahead of its time. But those who saw it in flight understood immediately. The old rules no longer applied. This was not an aircraft that followed convention. It rewrote it. What others called over-engineering, America would soon call insurance for the skies to come. And in the quiet hangars of California, beneath the glow of drafting lamps, the impossible was already preparing to fly again. By 1941, the experiment had become reality. From the assembly lines at Lockheed's Burbank plant rolled a machine that looked less like an aircraft and more like a question, sharp, symmetrical, defiant. The P-38 Lightning had arrived. Its arrival was not subtle. The Lightning dwarfed every fighter that came before it, 37 feet long, with wings wide enough to cast a shadow on the hangar floor like a small bomber. But beneath its polished aluminum skin was a singular purpose: to make speed and distance obey command. Each P-38 carried the same concentrated heartbeat, 4 50 caliber Browning machine guns and a 20mm Hispano cannon, all clustered in the nose. Unlike the wing-mounted weapons of other fighters, their fire converged into a single surgical stream. There was no need to aim for convergence. The pilot's crosshairs spoke for all 5 barrels at once. When the Lightning opened fire, its rounds arrived together, a thunderbolt in miniature. Yet mastery demanded discipline. 2 engines meant 2 minds, one for each throttle, one for each manifold, one for the pilot himself. Early trainees found their hands full and their confidence thin. To fly the Lightning was to conduct a duet, synchronize power, balance the yaw, tame the torque. Push one throttle too far, and the aircraft snarled. Push both with rhythm, and it sang. German engineers, reading captured reports, shook their heads. "Too complicated," they wrote. "No combat pilot will manage it in a fight." But in California, Lockheed's test pilots answered through action, not argument. They refined checklists, simplified gauges, and trained men to think like mechanics in motion. The engineers' reply was simple: "We'll train them." And they did. Squadron after squadron of young aviators learned to command the Lightning as if it were an extension of thought, to hear each engine's pulse, to feel imbalance before instruments warned of it. They spoke of the aircraft as though it were alive, temperamental but loyal. "She'll forgive your mistakes once," one instructor said, "but not twice." When flight tests pushed the P-38 into open air, disbelief turned to awe. At level flight, the Lightning surpassed 400 miles per hour, the first Allied fighter to do so. High above the Pacific coastline, its twin contrails stretched side by side like white ribbons across the sky. Reporters gathered to watch, noting that it did not bank so much as pivot, slicing air rather than wrestling it. It was grace disguised as weight. To those who had doubted it, the message was quiet but unmistakable. This ungainly machine, once mocked as a twin-tailed mistake, was rewriting the laws of aerial power. Its range promised patrols over oceans. Its firepower promised dominance. Its engines, tuned to the rhythm of persistence, promised survival. The Lightning had taken flight not only from runways, but from ridicule. Its silhouette, once the subject of laughter, was now the outline of something prophetic, a glimpse of the sky's future, cast in metal and will. And while the world below prepared for war in those twin streaks of white over California, the first whispers of what was coming began to form, the quiet promise of a storm no one yet understood. November 1942, the Mediterranean shimmers with the glare of invasion. From Gibraltar to Algiers, Allied convoys stretch across the sea, a steel tide carrying the hopes of a second front. Above them, a new shape moves through the sunlight. Twin engines, twin tails, the glint of untested promise. The P-38 Lightning is going to war. Operation Torch marks its baptism by fire. From bases newly carved into North African soil, the first squadrons of Lightnings rise into air still thick with desert dust. Their mission is simple in writing, impossible in practice, to protect the advancing forces from a Luftwaffe that has ruled this sky for 3 years. The Germans are waiting. The first encounter comes without ceremony. Over Tunisia's Oka ridges, a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s appears like hawks over prey. The Germans dive with confidence, their engines screaming through the thin air. They see the P-38s below, ungainly, broad-winged, alien, and the old mockery returns over the radio. "Fork-tailed furniture," one pilot laughs. Moments later, the laughter is drowned by gunfire. The battle is chaos. Lightning pilots, fresh from training, struggle with the complexity of their machines. The throttles must move as one. The turbo superchargers must sing in harmony. A single misstep can turn power into peril. And in the blur of the dogfight, physics itself becomes an enemy. At high speed, the P-38 begins to tremble. Its controls stiffen, its nose refuses to rise. Pilots call it compressibility, the invisible wall of air that builds at the edge of sound. No manual prepared them for it. Some dive too far, too fast, and never pull out. Others learn in seconds that altitude can kill as surely as bullets. In the aftermath of those first clashes, the airfields of North Africa are quiet. Mechanics stand beside the damaged Lightnings, bullet holes stitched across wings, engines coughing smoke, landing gear half collapsed. But the stories that return with the survivors are not of failure. They are of endurance. For every Lightning lost, another limps home. A wing shredded, a propeller feathered, one engine silent, yet it flies. Pilots learn to trust their machines, to coax them across hundreds of miles of desert and sea. The Germans, who expected easy prey, begin to notice the pattern. The clumsy twins refuse to die. In the following weeks, tactics evolve. The Lightning's strength is not in the turn, but in the strike. It is a hunter, not a duelist. Pilots learn to attack from altitude, to dive, fire, and vanish before the enemy can respond. Its long range becomes a weapon, its speed, a shield. Every mission refines the balance between aggression and survival. The Luftwaffe soon realizes it is facing something unfamiliar, a fighter that refuses the rules of engagement. The Bf-109 can climb, the FW-190 can turn, but neither can endure. When hit, they fall. When the Lightning is hit, it flies home. For German pilots used to dominance, this resilience feels like defiance. By December, the Desert War begins to tilt. Allied columns move inland under new skies, where contrails drift like white scars across the blue. To soldiers on the ground, the Lightning becomes a symbol of hope, a machine that seems to return from every mission, even when logic says it shouldn't. In Berlin, reports reach Goering's staff. The Americans' mistaken design is surviving, and worse, succeeding. The laughter grows thinner. One intelligence officer calls the P-38 the most dangerous twin-engined aircraft we have yet encountered. The Reichsmarschall dismisses it, but unease lingers in his silence. For the men who fly it, the Lightning has already earned its legend. It is no longer the impossible design. It is the aircraft that refuses surrender. And as the desert sun sets over Tunisia, its twin shadows stretch long across the sand, the mark of a new kind of warplane, one that learns, adapts, and endures. The Luftwaffe still calls it the fork-tailed devil, but the name now carries less laughter and more respect. War is not only a contest of speed, but of distance, of who can reach the battlefield and who can return. Over the wide emptiness of the Mediterranean, that truth became survival. For the pilots of the P-38 Lightning, endurance was not a luxury. It was the difference between vanishing and victory. Unlike the fragile single-engine fighters that filled Europe's skies, the Lightning carried two hearts. Each Allison V1710 engine worked in counter-rotation, eliminating torque and granting balance at impossible speeds. Together they made the aircraft a machine of confidence. Alone, each could still carry it home. Pilots would later say that when one engine died, the other began to speak louder, a promise whispered in mechanical rhythm. The missions demanded it. From bases in North Africa, Lightning struck across hundreds of miles of sea and sand, where a forced landing meant death or capture. The aircraft's range, over 1,300 miles with drop tanks, made it the longest-legged fighter in the world. It escorted bombers to Sicily, intercepted transports over the Aegean, and hunted reconnaissance aircraft at altitudes the Luftwaffe believed unreachable. But range was not enough. To master the P-38, pilots had to learn balance. Every movement of the throttle, every change in mixture or manifold pressure, altered the harmony between engines. Too much power on one side, and the Lightning would yaw violently. Too little, and it would stall into the very sky it ruled. Ground crews called the process tuning the twins. Each morning they adjusted fuel injectors, synchronized propellers, and listened for the perfect chord, the twin hum that meant both engines breathed as one. When that harmony held, the aircraft became something extraordinary. It could climb above the clouds, strike from the sun, and dive with a weight that shattered the air around it. P-38 pilots developed new tactics that no single engine rival could match. Long slashing attacks from the altitude, followed by diving retreats into distance. Their speed was their shield, their endurance, their weapon. To German interceptors, it was a nightmare made visible. The Lightning could appear from nowhere, a flash of silver at 25,000 feet, and vanish before pursuit began. Its twin contrails became omens above the Mediterranean, parallel scars across a blue sky, warning of unseen death. Luftwaffe radio operators gave it a name that would follow it forever: Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. The nickname was born in bitterness, but laced with respect. German pilots learned quickly that this was no lumbering curiosity. The Lightning could absorb punishment, return fire, and keep flying when others fell apart. Even damaged beyond logic, its dual engines carried it home, across deserts, across storms, across oceans. For the men who flew it, survival became ritual. Pilots spoke to their aircraft as they would to comrades. "Just one more mile," they'd whisper through cracked oxygen masks, coaxing the last sputtering propeller toward the safety of a distant field. And more often than not, the Lightning answered. By the spring of 1943, its legend was spreading, from North Africa to Italy, from rumor to recognition. The Luftwaffe, once so sure of its supremacy, now faced an opponent it could not outrun, outlast, or outthink. Every new sound in the sky carried doubt. Every glimmer of sunlight on metal might be the twin flash of the devil's wings. The P-38 had proven it could survive. But survival was only the beginning. Because on the far side of the ocean, another front was opening. One that would test not just endurance, but destiny itself. The Pacific was not a battlefield. It was an ocean without end. Islands scattered like stepping stones across 1,000 miles of blue. Each one a fortress, each one a grave. For most fighters, the distance alone was defeat. But for the P-38 Lightning, it was invitation. Here, at last, the twin engines found their element. The vast horizons that confined lesser machines became their proving ground. Over endless water and unbroken sky, the Lightning's endurance turned from feature to weapon. It could range farther, climb higher, and strike harder than anything the enemy could field. The Japanese Zero, light and agile, had dominated the early war. Its grace in combat was unmatched, until now. Against the Lightning, its advantages dissolved. The Zero could twist and roll, but it could not climb to safety, nor outrun the metal storm that descended from above. At 25,000 feet, the duel of maneuver gave way to a duel of mathematics, speed, altitude, and firepower. And in that new arithmetic, the Lightning always won. Its pilots learned to fight not with instinct, but with geometry. They attacked from altitude, dove with precision, and used their speed to vanish before the enemy could react. Boom and zoom, they called it, a tactic born of patience and confidence. The Japanese never adapted. Their fragile fighters, built for grace, broke apart under the weight of modernity. Each mission expanded the map of what was possible. From bases in the Solomons and New Guinea, the Lightning escorted bombers across seas once thought impassable. It became the first American fighter to reach Rabaul, then the first to cover raids deep into the Philippines, and finally, the first to escort bombers all the way to Tokyo. In a war defined by range, the Lightning had made the Pacific small, but behind every sortie was a human story of fatigue, precision, and faith in machinery. The pilots who flew these missions spent hours in solitude, guided only by compass, fuel gauge, and trust. The cockpit became both cradle and coffin, oxygen thin, heat suffocating, the world reduced to the steady heartbeat of twin propellers. When they returned, salt crusted their flight suits, and silence filled their eyes. They had seen the curvature of the earth, and the fragility of men upon it. Among them rose legends: Major Richard Bong, quiet, methodical, deadly, 40 aerial victories, the highest-scoring American ace of the war. His rival and friend, Thomas Maguire, close behind with 38. They became symbols of precision, not reckless daring, but controlled inevitability. Bong once said, "I don't shoot until I'm sure." In those 5 words lay the Lightning's philosophy: no waste, no chance, no mercy. The Japanese began to speak of the twin-tailed monster. Their reconnaissance pilots reported seeing it long before hearing it, its silver skin catching sunlight like a blade. For them, its approach was the sound of endings. They called it the two-headed dragon, a creature that could strike, retreat, and return long after its prey had fallen silent. Even in Europe, the reputation crossed oceans. Goering's intelligence officers, still dismissive of American engineering, received reports from the Pacific that made them pause. Pilots claimed this same fork-tailed devil could outrange any interceptor, outclimb any opponent, and fly home on half an engine. An exaggeration, Goering insisted, but the unease lingered. By 1944, half a world away from its birthplace, the Lightning had transcended doubt. It was no longer an experiment or an oddity. It was a system perfected by struggle, sanctified by distance. Its twin engines had become twin symbols of reach and of resilience, of a nation learning that power could be measured not in glory, but in endurance. In the Pacific dusk, as the last Lightnings returned to base, their contrails glowed pink against the fading sky, 2 streaks of light across an empire of water. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, the next chapter of their legend was already waiting, because soon the Lightning would not just fight across oceans, it would strike at destiny itself. By 1943, the P-38 Lightning had proven it could fly farther, fight longer, and strike harder than any aircraft before it. But there remained one enemy it could not outclimb: physics itself. Somewhere beyond 25,000 feet, in the thin air above the clouds, a hidden boundary waited. Pilots called it the Wall. They would dive toward the Earth at nearly 500 miles per hour, only to find the controls frozen, the stick locked, the nose refusing to rise. The air, once their element, became their executioner. In North Africa and the Pacific, Lightning pilots vanished into the sea or desert, their final moments witnessed only by the instruments that betrayed them. Reports returned of aircraft entering dives and never recovering, engines screaming past safe limits, wings shuddering, controls immovable. Mechanics blamed hydraulics, pilots blamed training. But engineers at Lockheed knew the truth lay deeper, somewhere between the known and the unknown. At Burbank, Kelly Johnson and his team turned their attention from design to physics. They worked alongside the scientists of NEXIE, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the quiet architects of flight's invisible frontiers. Together, they studied the unseeable, the way air thickened against an aircraft at near supersonic speed, the pressure waves forming beneath its wings. The Lightning was encountering what no pilot had faced before: compressibility, the threshold of sound. The phenomenon was brutal in its simplicity. As the aircraft approached the speed of sound, the airflow over its wings could no longer move aside fast enough. Shock waves formed, altering lift, locking controls, and sealing the pilot's fate. No manual had warned of it, because no one had flown fast enough to meet it. The P-38, built for power, had flown into the edge of the future, and paid the price. In wind tunnels and laboratories, miniature Lightnings were subjected to torrents of air. Engineers mapped the flow with smoke and sensors, measuring turbulence in fractions of an inch. The solution, when it came, was not a grand invention, but a subtle one: a small, curved panel beneath each wing, designed to change the airflow and restore control. They called it the dive recovery flap. It was a quiet revolution. By late 1943, test pilots began to try again. At Lockheed's proving grounds, a Lightning climbed to 35,000 feet, leveled off, and began its dive. The altimeter spun like a clock gone mad. the speed climbed, and then, as the flaps deployed, the nose lifted. The aircraft leveled, the pilot lived. For the first time, man had outthought the sky's invisible trap. Word spread quickly through the squadrons. The Lightning's curse had been broken. Pilots began to trust their aircraft again, to dive without fear, to chase the enemy into realms they once avoided. What had been a liability became a secret weapon, the first operational fighter in history to understand and survive the boundary of sound. German scientists, watching from afar, struggled to comprehend how the Americans had solved what they barely understood. Their own experiments with high-speed flight were still theoretical, confined to paper and wind tunnels scarred by war. The Luftwaffe's engineers spoke of transonic effects, but lacked the resources to tame them. In contrast, the Americans were already flying through them. At altitude, the P-38 became untouchable. Its turbo-supercharged engines devoured the thin air and turned it into speed. Where German fighters gasped for oxygen, the Lightning thrived. Its oxygen systems, electrical heaters, and high-altitude performance created a new kind of pilot, part aviator, part astronaut, moving through stratospheres the enemy could not reach. Luftwaffe reports began to tell the same story. Aircraft struck without warning, shredded before their pilots even saw the attacker. The Lightning no longer needed surprise. It possessed inevitability. From miles away, its clustered guns converged their fire with surgical precision. German pilots would later describe being hit by a ghost, an unseen force that appeared, fired, and vanished into the sun. The fork-tailed devil, once dismissed as too strange to survive, had mastered the very forces that destroyed it. It was no longer just an aircraft. It was a laboratory with wings, a proof that intellect could conquer even nature's fiercest laws. And as engineers celebrated their quiet victory over the physics of death, a new kind of confidence spread through the Allied air forces. The Lightning had crossed a threshold not just of speed, but of understanding. And soon, that understanding would be turned towards something even more precise and far more personal. April 18th, 1943. In the still morning air over the Pacific, 16 P-38 Lightnings lifted from the red earth of Guadalcanal. Their orders were not routine. There would be no formation, no radio chatter, no margin for error. Each man in the cockpit knew the name of his target, a name that had begun a war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was scheduled to inspect frontline bases in the northern Solomon Islands. It was to be a simple morale mission, but American codebreakers, silent guardians in dimly lit rooms thousands of miles away, had intercepted his itinerary, the time, the route, even the altitude. For once, destiny came printed on paper. To reach him, the P-38s would have to fly 400 miles through enemy territory, skimming the ocean at wave-top height to avoid detection. It was a flight at the limit of range, calculation, and nerve. There could be no second attempt. Each aircraft carried drop tanks for fuel, each pilot a single hope to strike and return. The operations architect, Major John Mitchell, plotted the intercept with a navigator's precision. Timing would be everything. If they arrived too early, the ambush would be obvious. Too late, and Yamamoto would be gone. The entire plan relied on a single perfect equation, one line drawn across a map of blue. The Lightnings flew in silence. Hours passed, the sea unbroken, the horizon featureless. At 20 feet above the waves, every movement of the throttle mattered. Even a few feet too high would betray their position to Japanese radar. Pilots clenched their jaws, watching fuel gauges drop with every passing minute. The mission was both audacious and impossible. a bet placed against geography itself. Then, near Bougainville, the jungle appeared beneath them, and with it, their prey. 2 twin-engine Betty bombers, flanked by 6 Zero escorts, approached on schedule, glinting in the tropical sun. Yamamoto's plane flew on the right, his staff officers on the left. The P-38s rose from the sea like phantoms. Lieutenant Rex Barber and Captain Thomas Lanphier split from formation, each selecting a target. At 1,000 yards, the Lightning's concentrated nose guns, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, opened fire. The first Betty shuddered, banked hard, and vanished into the jungle canopy. Moments later, the second exploded mid-air. The ambush was complete before the Zeros even turned to fight. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese pilots who landed nearby found the wreckage still burning. Yamamoto's body was recovered seated upright, his sword still at his side. He had been killed instantly, a single bullet through the heart. The architect of Pearl Harbor, who had once promised to run wild for 6 months, had reached his final horizon. Word of the operation spread in whispers. To the American crews on Guadalcanal, it felt unreal, a mission too precise, too perfect to have worked. For the intelligence officers who had decrypted the code, it was vindication. For the pilots, it was proof of what planning, endurance, and the right machine could achieve together. Even in Berlin, the feat did not go unnoticed. Goering's analysts studied the details in disbelief. The range, the timing, the accuracy. It seemed inconceivable that any air force could coordinate such an assassination from the air. One Luftwaffe report concluded simply, "No German aircraft could have done this." The P-38 had transcended its reputation as a mere fighter. It was now a weapon of precision, an instrument of intellect as much as of speed. Its twin engines had carried not just bombs and bullets, but intention itself, a statement that war had entered a new age where data and distance mattered more than luck. Yamamoto's death sent ripples through the Pacific. The Empire had lost not just a leader, but a symbol of invincibility, and in that silence, between the fading echoes of gunfire and the low hum of returning lightnings, the world glimpsed what air power had become, not a contest of courage, but of calculation. The Lightning had crossed from innovation to legend, and on distant horizons, its shadow was already lengthening, because soon it would return to Europe, where its next battles would not be against men, but against belief itself. By late 1943, the Lightning had come home, not to peace, but to vengeance. Across the Atlantic, its return to Europe marked more than the arrival of an aircraft. It was the return of a prophecy fulfilled. What had once been dismissed as an experiment now glinted in silver squadrons over the grey skies of the continent it was built to challenge. From bases in England and the Mediterranean, new variants of the P-38, sleeker, faster, hardened by the lessons of 2 oceans, began their advance. Their mission was simple in writing, impossible in practice, to escort bombers deep into the heart of the Reich. Berlin, Regensburg, Schweinfurt, cities protected not by walls, but by the best pilots Germany had ever produced. At dawn, their formations rose in quiet rhythm, the hum of twin engines blending with the deeper roar of B-17s and B-24s. From the ground, they looked like a slow-moving tide. From above, they were geometry in motion. The Luftwaffe scrambled its interceptors, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbing through the haze to meet them. But the war had changed. The old certainties of dominance were gone. The first encounters were decisive. German pilots who had once mocked the Lightning's shape now found themselves hunted by it. Its turbo-supercharged engines thrived where theirs gasped for air. At 30,000 feet, the thin atmosphere favored the Americans. From those heights, lightnings dived upon their targets like falling stars. Fast, silent, and surgical. In seconds, the sky erupted with converging fire. To the Luftwaffe, the attacks felt unnatural, mechanical, methodical, unrelenting. "They came from nowhere," one pilot wrote. "We never saw them until the tracers passed through our wings." The P-38's clustered guns, focused at the nose, turned accuracy into inevitability. From half a mile away, its bursts found their mark. There was no warning, no guesswork, only precision. The German advantage of experience began to erode. Their aces, veterans of Spain and the Battle of Britain, found themselves drained not by fear, but by fatigue. The enemy no longer fought like men. They fought like systems. Each lightning carried radios tuned to coordination, instruments synced to altitudes and bearings. The war of skill had become a war of organization, and Germany was falling behind. On the ground, the people of occupied Europe began to look up and recognize the shape that streaked above them. The twin booms, the flash of sunlight on metal. It became a symbol whispered among the resistance, a promise that the skies no longer belonged to the Reich. Even the Luftwaffe began to speak the name with a kind of reverence. Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. In his Berlin headquarters, Hermann Göring read the latest combat reports with growing disbelief. His analysts described American aircraft that could reach any target in Europe and still return home. He demanded answers, explanations, excuses. None came. Finally, in a rare moment of honesty, he confessed to his staff, "When I saw those lightnings, I knew we had lost the war." It was not the confession of defeat, but of comprehension. Göring understood that the battle had shifted from courage to capacity. The Lightning was not just an airplane, it was the embodiment of a nation that had learned to make complexity reliable, to turn innovation into repetition. Germany had built for perfection. America had built for endurance. By winter, the skies over Europe had changed color. Where once German contrails crisscrossed freely, now American formations filled the horizon. Each mission extended farther, struck deeper, returned stronger. For every lightning lost, another took its place before the wreck cooled. The laughter of 1942, the disbelief, the arrogance, the mockery, had been replaced by silence. Radio frequencies once alive with orders and bravado now crackled with broken signals and retreat. Above the ruins of Hamburg and the smoke of Schweinfurt, the P-38's twin shadows passed over a dying empire. The same silhouette that had drawn ridicule now carried inevitability. The fork-tailed devil had become something greater, a symbol of precision as power, of industry as destiny. And as it climbed once more into the cold, thin air above Europe, one question lingered below. If this machine could reach so far, how much further would mankind go next? Calculation in motion, a proof that intellect could survive where luck could not. Inside the cockpit, the world was divided into dials and decisions. The Lightning demanded more than bravery. It required discipline. Every throttle movement, every mixture adjustment, every glance at the manifold gauge carried consequence. To fly the P-38 was to balance two hearts beating in mechanical unison, two engines that could either save a life or betray it. Pilots often said that the Lightning wasn't flown, it was managed. And when managed well, it became an extension of thought. They learned to trust its contradictions. The same plane that seemed too heavy to dance could climb like a prayer. Its twin booms, once mocked as awkward, now sliced through the air with quiet authority. The aircraft did not forgive recklessness, but it rewarded mastery. Its best pilots, men like Thomas Lanphier, Charles MacDonald, and Richard Bong, described it not as a weapon, but as a partner. Bong would later say, It knew what I wanted before I did. In combat, that partnership was everything. A Lightning could take punishment that would destroy any other fighter. Fuel lines ruptured, controls shredded, engines torn apart, and still, it flew. One pilot returned to base with half a wing missing. Another landed safely after his canopy, and instruments were blown away. When asked how he made it back, he answered quietly, "Because it wanted to." The Lightning had become a guardian as much as a killer. For the men inside it, survival became a matter of process. Their confidence was not arrogance, but understanding, the calm of those who knew both the limits of their machine and the laws of the air. In the chaos of combat, they measured distance in seconds and death in degrees. Where the Luftwaffe once fought with instinct and improvisation, the Lightning pilots fought with rhythm and reason. War photographers began to notice them, not for their swagger, but for their precision. Images of P-38s glinting over cloud banks became icons of modern warfare. Clean, symmetrical, impersonal. The aircraft seemed to belong not to men, but to an era. In those photographs, the old romance of flight, the scarf, the smile, the cigarette, had vanished. What replaced it was something colder, more permanent. The age of the engineer had arrived. To the Luftwaffe, the change was psychological before it was physical. The German advantage, once rooted in confidence in the mythology of the ace, began to crumble against an enemy that treated air combat as a science. Their veterans, once gods of the sky, now faced formations that moved like machines. Tight, efficient, emotionless. The old rituals of dogfighting no longer mattered. The Lightning pilots killed not with fury, but with method. The balance of fear had shifted. Where once German voices had filled the radio with laughter and bravado, now there was only static. Pilots who once mocked the fork-tailed devil now avoided its shadow. Goering's promise of air supremacy had dissolved into memory, replaced by reports of unseen strikes and unstoppable escorts. In the hands of these new aviators, the Lightning became more than an aircraft. It became a statement of philosophy. That victory no longer belonged to the fastest or the boldest, but to those who could think with machines. The cockpit had become the frontier of reason itself, and high above the clouds, as Lightnings carved their contrails across Europe, one truth became clear. The sky was no longer ruled by instinct. It was ruled by understanding. But as new aircraft emerged to replace the P-38, the pilots who had mastered it would soon face another question, one not of survival, but of legacy. What happens when the machine you trust becomes the past? By 1944, the sky had grown crowded with legends. The P-51 Mustang, sleek, elegant, efficient, now bore the weight of the war's final momentum. Its range and speed carried bombers all the way to Berlin and back. To many, it seemed the Lightning's time had passed, but among the veterans who had flown it through North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific, there was no doubt the Mustang had inherited the path the Lightning had carved. For the P-38 had been the teacher, the aircraft that proved what was possible. It was the bridge between eras, between the fragile biplanes of the past and the coming storm of jets. Every innovation the Lightning introduced, its twin engines, turbo superchargers, and nose-mounted armament, had rewritten aviation doctrine. The lessons of its design had changed not only the war, but the future of flight itself. Lockheed's engineers understood this more deeply than anyone. In their California workshops, the men who had once built the Lightning began sketching new shapes on clean drafting tables, shapes without propellers, driven not by pistons but by thrust. The knowledge earned from every vibration, every airflow test, every broken prototype of the P-38 became the blueprint for the next age. In its shadow, the jet was already being born. The war had transformed Lockheed from a company of craftsmen into an institution of systems. They no longer built airplanes, they built principles, redundancy, balance, symmetry. The twin-engine philosophy that had once seemed excessive now became a foundation for safety and performance. Even the Lightning's aerodynamic struggles, its dives, compressibility, and recoveries, provided the data that would define high-speed flight for decades to come. To the pilots, this transition felt almost spiritual. They had lived through the Lightning's evolution, from skepticism to supremacy, and saw in it the pattern of progress itself, that innovation always walks hand in hand with doubt. Many of them, grounded by the war's end, would go on to test the jet fighters that followed. They carried with them the reflexes of a machine that had taught them precision, patience, and respect for complexity. Across the Atlantic, the war was nearing its quiet conclusion. Germany's cities lay in rubble, its skies, once filled with Messerschmitts, now stood empty. Goering's laughter, that sound of arrogance that had once echoed through the marble corridors of Berlin, had long since vanished. He had believed that willpower could outfly logic, that ideology could outbuild engineering. The wreckage around him was proof of how wrong he had been. In his defeat lay the moral of the Lightning story. The aircraft was not merely a weapon, it was a testament to the civilization that built it, a culture that placed faith in machinery, in process, in reason. Where the Reich had trusted domination, America had trusted design. The outcome was more than victory, it was vindication. For the first time in human history, technology itself had become a kind of ideology, not bound by politics or geography, but by precision. The Lightning was its herald, a messenger of what was to come, an age where supremacy would be measured not in courage, but in computation. And yet, for all its brilliance, the P-38 remained human. Every rivet bore the touch of the hands that built it. Every mission reflected the discipline of the mind that flew it. It was the rare machine that captured both the spirit of its makers and the morality of its time. By the war's end, as newer fighters replaced it, and peace returned to the skies, the Lightning stood at the edge of perfection, not because it was flawless, but because it had reached the limit of what propellers could do. The next frontier would belong to jet engines, to speeds and altitudes once considered impossible. But every contrail that pierced that frontier would trace its lineage back to the P-38. In its twin shadows stretched the outline of the century to come, a world defined by engineering, by order, and by faith in the power of progress. And as its final squadrons disappeared into history, one truth remained suspended in the silence above the clouds. The war had been won not by men who laughed at the future, but by those who built it. When the guns finally fell silent, the Lightning's thunder faded with them. The war that had birthed it was over, and peace, swift, mechanical, unceremonious, reclaimed the skies. Across airfields from England to the Pacific, rows of P-38s stood wingtip to wingtip, gleaming under a quiet sun. They had once been instruments of precision, the cutting edge of industrial power. Now they were surplus. Within months, scrapyards filled with their remains. Perfectly serviceable aircraft were towed away, stripped of instruments and engines, and reduced to piles of dull aluminum. Progress had no sentiment. The jet age was arriving, and the Lightning, once the future, was suddenly the past. Men who had flown it watched in silence as their machines were melted down to build washing machines, cars, and peacetime prosperity. Yet in the pages of their memoirs and in the grain of old photographs, the Lightning lived on. Veterans remembered the hum of twin propellers at dawn, the shudder of the nose cannon, the faint tremor that passed through the controls as the turbochargers bit into thin air. To them, the aircraft was more than metal. It was memory made tangible. Many would write that the P-38 was not the easiest plane to fly, but the one they trusted most to bring them home. In hangars and small museums, a few survivors were spared the torch. Volunteers and engineers worked for decades to resurrect them, polishing dull aluminum back into silver, coaxing life from engines that had slept for half a century. When one of them finally took flight again, the sound of its twin Allisons filled the air like a ghostly echo of another time. For a brief moment, the world could hear history breathing. Even former enemies remembered it. Decades later, Luftwaffe veterans spoke of their encounters with an odd mixture of respect and disbelief. It was like fighting a machine from another world, one pilot recalled. We thought we understood air combat until we met the Lightning. Their tone was not bitterness, but recognition. They had seen the horizon of their age, and it had flown past them. Historians now place the P-38 at a crossroads, the bridge between propeller and jet, between instinct and engineering. It was the first aircraft to truly merge the pilot with the machine. Not a knight on a horse, but a mind in a mechanism. In its aluminum veins flowed the ideas that would define the Cold War: standardization, reliability, reach. It symbolized the moment when science became not a support for strategy, but strategy itself. Every bolt, every curve, every test flight had turned knowledge into advantage. The Lightning's legacy was not only in the wars it fought, but in the kind of world it foretold. A world where design and discipline would decide destiny. Today, the few surviving Lightnings stand motionless, their wings stretched across museum hangars in silence. Children look up at them without knowing that they once reshaped the sky. Pilots, now old and gray, sometimes visit and rest a hand on the cold metal, the same aluminum that once carried them through fire and fear. And for a moment, their eyes soften, as if hearing engines that no longer turn. The P-38. Lightning's story did not end in the scrapyard. Its myth outlived its metal. It endured not because it was perfect, but because it represented something eternal, the human belief that innovation can outpace destruction, and though time has grounded it, the echo of its engines remains, faint but certain, somewhere between memory and sky. Because legends, unlike machines, are never truly retired. They remembered the sound before they remembered the sky. Not the gunfire, not the wind, but the hum. Two engines, tuned in perfect opposition, a metallic harmony that seemed almost alive. Pilots called it the heartbeat of the Lightning, the rhythm that guided them through cloud and chaos, through the thin edge between mastery and mortality. Each flight began the same way, two propellers turning in mirrored motion, their pitch rising together until it became a single, unbroken tone. It was more than a sound. It was a promise. The P-38 was not merely a machine of war. It was an act of faith in design itself. Where earlier aircraft relied on instinct, the Lightning demanded precision. Every movement of throttle and trim had to be balanced. Every vibration read like a pulse. To the men who flew it, survival became a form of calculation. There was no room for recklessness, no space for ego. Each sortie reminded them that endurance came not from courage alone, but from control. In its cockpit, framed by aluminum and logic, they learned that the future of warfare belonged not to emotion, but to engineering. They came to trust the machine as one trusts a comrade. When an engine failed, the other carried them home. When fuel ran thin, efficiency and discipline took the place of luck. Lightning pilots often spoke of their aircraft as if it were sentient, a living mechanism that wanted to return, that refused to let go of life. You could feel it think, one said. You could feel it care whether you lived or died. That feeling, of mind joined to metal, lingered long after the war ended. For the engineers who had built it, the P-38 was never a finished chapter. Kelly Johnson and his Lockheed team would carry its lessons into the jet age. They took the Lightning's DNA, its twin engines, its aerodynamic daring, its demand for precision, and turned it into something faster, higher, quieter. The Skunk Works was born, and from it came the U-2, the SR-71, and a lineage of aircraft that redefined what the human mind could command. Each new design traced its ancestry back to the same principle: balance through innovation. The Lightning had proved that complexity could serve simplicity, that two engines could act as one, that power could exist in harmony. Its engineers had built not just a plane, but a philosophy, one that outlived them all. For the pilots, that philosophy became personal. Decades later, in interviews and reunions, they still spoke of the P-38 with reverence. They remembered the twin shadow it cast across the clouds, the vibration in their bones, the hum that carried them through exhaustion and fear. It was the sound of survival, the sound of progress, the sound of belief, and perhaps more than anything, it was the sound of humility, a reminder that even the most advanced machine depends on the hands and hearts that guide it. The Lightning taught them that mastery was never domination, but cooperation between man and metal, between innovation and endurance. Long after its last mission, the sound of those two engines still echoed in memory. It was the pulse of an era, a sound not of destruction, but of creation, the hum of reason rising above the storm. Because the Lightning had done more than win battles, it had taught a generation to listen, not to the noise of war, but to the harmony of invention. And from that harmony, a new age of flight was born. The P-38 Lightning's story is not one of dominance, but of understanding. It was never simply about victory in the sky. It was about how a nation learned to think differently about power itself. The Lightning did not win by aggression, nor by courage alone. It won by mastering complexity. In an age that still worshipped instinct and charisma, it became proof that intellect could be a weapon mightier than pride. For centuries, war had belonged to the bold, to the duelist, the ace, the commander whose will could bend chaos into order. But the Lightning changed that equation. Its twin engines, intricate systems, and precise coordination demanded more than bravery. They demanded comprehension. Every pilot who sat inside it had to think like an engineer. Every mission required not passion, but procedure. The P-38 turned warfare from a test of will into a test of understanding, the triumph of the measured mind over the impulsive hand. To Goering, that shift was unimaginable. He embodied the old world, a realm of ego and instinct, where victory was a matter of personal dominance. When he laughed at the Lightning's design in 1942, he was not mocking an airplane. He was mocking the idea that discipline and design could outmatch confidence and charisma. His laughter was the last breath of an era soon to die. For when the Lightning rose, it carried with it not just engines and guns, but a new philosophy. It symbolized a civilization that had begun to place its faith not in destiny, but in data, not in personality, but in process. Its victories were not accidents of valor, but results of mathematics, of testing, of men and women who believed that precision itself was moral. In that sense, the P-38 was not simply an aircraft. It was a statement of who would inherit the future. The nations that learned to master the machine would shape the century. Those that clung to myth would vanish beneath the hum of progress. From its twin booms stretched a bridge between eras, from the emotional warfare of the past to the calculated wars of the modern age. Historians often call it the bridge to the jet age, but it was more than that. It was the bridge between imagination and implementation, between arrogance and adaptation. The Lightning was not flawless. It was fragile, demanding, difficult. But that difficulty was the point. It required trust. Trust in the engineer's mind, trust in procedure, trust in the idea that human order could tame mechanical chaos. Its legacy, then, was not written in victories, but in virtues: logic, discipline, precision. These were the tools of the new world, the instruments of a century that would be built not by heroes, but by designers. In the end, even those who once mocked it came to understand. The Luftwaffe pilots who had dismissed the fork-tailed devil later spoke of it with respect, even awe. They had seen what it represented, not just the might of an enemy, but the evolution of warfare itself. "We were fighting the future," one said. And the future does not lose. The Lightning's greatest lesson was humility, the understanding that laughter is always the sound before learning. It taught both sides that progress is not born of pride, but of patience, that true power is not loud, but precise. By the time the smoke cleared, its silhouette had faded into history, yet its meaning remained, etched across the sky it once ruled. Because long before the world entered the jet age, the Lightning had already shown what was coming, a horizon shaped not by ego, but by intellect. In its contrails, the future was already waiting. In 1942, they laughed. In briefing rooms and cockpits, across the mess halls of the Luftwaffe, the photographs of a strange American fighter were passed around with disbelief. 2 engines, 2 tails, and a cockpit suspended like an afterthought. It looked ungainly, impossible, even foolish. German aces joked that it was an engineer's fantasy that would never survive a real war. They called it the fork-tailed devil, half mockery, half myth. But by 1945, the laughter was gone. It had vanished into static-filled radios, into the long silence that followed defeat. The wreckage of their own airfields told the story better than any speech could. The P-38 Lightning had not just proven itself as a machine. It had proven something larger, that ingenuity, discipline, and reason could achieve what arrogance and instinct could not. Every nation begins a war believing in its own strength. The Germans had believed in the will to power, in spirit and speed, in domination by force. The Americans believed in something quieter, that intellect could be industrialized, that precision could become power. The Lightning was born from that belief. It was not forged by generals, but by engineers, built in drafts and decimals, long before the first bullet was fired. When Goering first heard of the twin-boomed fighter, he dismissed it with a sneer. He trusted charisma over calculation, loyalty over logic. But as the war dragged on, his skies filled with aircraft he could neither outfly nor outthink. The very machine he had laughed at became a symbol of everything his empire could never replicate: coordination, complexity, collaboration. The P-38 was not perfect. It was difficult to fly, complex to maintain, and demanding of those who commanded it. But that was its lesson. Progress requires patience, and mastery demands humility. It turned pilots into tacticians, mechanics into scientists. It made war less about daring and more about understanding. It was the moment when the mythology of heroism gave way to the machinery of intellect. By the end, even the Luftwaffe's survivors spoke of it with reverence. They had seen the Lightning strike from beyond their sight lines, its guns perfectly zeroed, its engines singing a duet of inevitability. It was like being hunted by the future, one German pilot admitted, and the future had already learned how to aim. What had begun as laughter became revelation. The P-38 showed that the battlefield was no longer ruled by the loudest voice or the boldest charge. but by the mind capable of mastering the invisible: physics, airflow, design. It taught the world that courage without comprehension was no longer enough. The age of the intuitive warrior had ended. The age of the engineer had begun. Its legacy outlasted the war. In its design were the seeds of everything that followed: the jet, the stealth, the supersonic. Its creators went on to build the machines that would circle the Earth and break the sound barrier. The P-38's twin tails became the twin engines of an era: technology and reason, propelling mankind toward the horizon it once feared. Goering's Reich had been built on faith in dominance. The Lightning's America was built on faith in process. One crumbled in its own noise, the other soared on the quiet hum of turbines and thought. In the ruins of Europe, among the wrecked hangars and burned airstrips, the truth stood unspoken but undeniable. The future would belong not to those who laughed at the improbable, but to those who built it anyway. And so, as the war ended and the world moved into the jet age, the silhouette of the P-38 lingered, not as a relic, but as a reminder. That progress, no matter how absurd it first appears, always begins with someone refusing to believe in limits. They had laughed once, at the shape, the size, the absurdity. But when the smoke cleared and the skies fell silent, the sound that remained was not laughter. It was the low hum of two engines, echoing across history, the rhythm of reason, the heartbeat of invention. They laughed once. They never laughed again.